This is important, and what has been really shown to me as I work with my students and have for many years, we as humans in the current world, in the current modern world, where we're not living in direct connection with nature, we have had decades and centuries really, of conditioning, rules, society, cultural norms that keep many of us suppressed and in little boxes. These things cage us, and we are animals. We're humans, but we also have mammalian physiology. So we have the same physiology as our cats and our dogs and the zebras and the deer and all these big mammals that are on Earth and in seawater. And it used to be thought, so I'm going to go into nervous system science here, and this is where the polyvagal theory comes in. So if you've heard of the polyvagal theory, let me know. If you've never heard of it, let me know too. I'm going to keep it super simple and hopefully under 10 minutes. Again, I've done lectures 90 minutes long on these topics. If you want a deeper dive into polyvagal, please check out those. So back in the day, even when I was in university learning physiology, there was this thought that our autonomic nervous system, this is the nervous system that governs all of our digestion, our hormone release, temperature regulation, everything that we don't have to think about. That's why it's automatic. There was a thought that the portion of this nervous system that governs fight, flight, so I'm going to fight you because you're attacking me, or I'm going to flee because I can't attack you, I got to get out of here. That sympathetic fight, flight, that and parasympathetic nervous system, which used to be just coined rest, digest, had what we call a reciprocal innervation. So when one went up, the other went down. When the other went up, the other went down. It was like this teeter-totter. We now know that that's not as simple as it sounds. And that is because of a researcher named Stephen Porges. So Stephen Porges has been studying this stuff for decades, since I was probably in elementary school. And it was sort of in the 90s, I believe, his papers started coming out. And his first book on the polyvagal theory, it came out, I believe, in 2011. So that's fairly new in terms of rewriting biology and science of the human physiology. And so what he found is that it isn't just this reciprocal innervation where one goes up and one goes down. There is a hierarchical kind of orchestration of our survival responses in relationship to how we socially engage. And that social engagement comes into play in terms of how we were raised. So I'm going to slow down. When I talk about early trauma, when you hear early trauma connects to chronic illness, we have to understand what happened to us in the first 3 years of life. So when we come out of mama, we have some portions of this autonomic nervous system working. Let's say full-term baby, healthy, can poop, can pee, can cry, can suckle. Their digestion and all of the stuff that clears waste and creates urine is working. This is a portion of the parasympathetic, one portion of the parasympathetic called the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve, the low tone dorsal branch. What also is working is their ability to shut down and to freeze and to collapse. And this is called, again, part of the parasympathetic nervous system. It's also the dorsal branch of the vagus, and it's the high tone dorsal branch. Don't worry if you don't get all this. I want to just cover this for the science geeks here so that we set the record straight that this is what the polyvagal theory is. So we have rest, digest, babies born with that, low tone dorsal of the parasympathetic. Also part of the parasympathetic, the high tone dorsal, is this collapse, this shutdown. I can't fight, I can't flee. Nobody's picking me up when I'm crying. I'm in terror because of this surgery happening to me when I come out of mama's womb. Umbilical cord wrapped around the neck, all the things, I go into shutdown. So that's parasympathetic. Now there's one other branch of the parasympathetic, and this is where Porges's work really kind of shifted the understanding of how we as humans, mammals, work and function. One portion of the vagus nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system is called the ventral vagal. This just means front, just means that this nerve that comes out of our brain area comes in front of our brain stem that I can't really point to, but it's back here. And it innervates parts of the face, the inner ear, the throat box, but also the heart. And it creates a pacemaker. Some people have heard of the pacemaker of the heart. Some people, when they have a heart that's off, they get a pacemaker installed. We have a natural pacemaker. And this pacemaker helps us regulate. So this is where the key buzzwords like self-regulation come on board. So someone who has had good, yummy, good connection with their mother, attunement, attachment, safety, you cry, she picks you up, she feeds, she rocks, she soothes you, she sees your face, she smiles, she coos, she speaks to you like a real human, all these things. That builds up this portion of our parasympathetic nervous system, our ventral vagal nerve, part of our vagus nerve that goes to our face, all this, and our heart. This is why when you talk to someone who's just a friendly face, it could be a stranger, it could be a first responder, and you're a little nervous and you talk and they have gentle eyes and they slow their speech down, some of us will calm down. And that is directly going to our heart via this vagus portion of the ventral vagal branch of our parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. That's about as deep as I'm going to get. I'll bring these terms in as I talk. So when we're little, we want good connection and attunement. I got into this in my lecture yesterday on interoception and integration. Not going to get into all the specifics, but the key thing to know, when we have good, secure attachment connection, we build up a robust, resilient nervous system. And it's not just a theory or an idea. Parts of the nerves that go to the heart and the face, part of this social engagement nervous system, they get what's called myelinated. And this is a fatty sheath that covers our nerves to make transmission of impulse smooth and easy and refined. So it calms us down, it slows us down in a nice, gentle, easy way. Remember how I talked about the other portion of the parasympathetic, the dorsal branch that governs our freeze response, also governs our rest digest? That nerve, that portion is not myelinated. It also slows us down, but it slows us down in a much more abrupt, quick way. It's the slamming on of the brakes. I can't fight, I can't flee, deer in the headlight, freeze. Quick, it's quick. If you've ever fainted, has anybody here fainted? You see something you don't like, and before you know it, you passed out on the floor. That's how quick it is. And it's a survival mechanism. We need these survival mechanisms. Now, the trouble or the problem, whatever adjective you want to use, we're not meant to be stuck in fight, flight. So something bad is happening to us. We feel the fight, flight. We want to fight. We want to flee. We can't. It's our parent. It's a school teacher. We go into kind of a freeze response. This also has a bit of this sympathetic in there. And if we realize, whoa, there's no hope in hell, I'm going to fight this person or get out of here. Heck, I'm 5. And you don't think this when you're 5. You just know it. I can't leave my house because I'm helpless. I'm a little person. And certainly an infant. They can't get up off of their diaper changing table when their caregiver is treating them poorly and walk out the door. So what happens? We become helpless. We go into the next phase. Remember how I said with polyvagal theory, it's a hierarchical orchestration of survival strategy. If we can't connect and soothe the situation, or someone can't soothe us, and if we can't fight, flight, we collapse. We go into shutdown. And this is what's called the high tone dorsal branch of the vagus nerve of the parasympathetic. So, all that to say, we have a very complex nervous system, autonomic nervous system, that can keep us stuck in these survival responses. And because of our higher brain as humans, we can resist, we can suppress, we can keep our fight flight mechanisms on hold for a very long time. And one of the first persons, before even the polyvagal theory information came out, who understood why is it that humans in captivity, they get sick and PTSD, but animals in the wild, not in captivity, not in zoos or being caged, they thrive even under intense circumstances, natural disasters, predators, all these things. They are robust. You do not see a wild animal out in the world who has metabolic disease, who has excess fat stores on their body, except of course for bears that go into hibernation, those sorts of animals, they put that on for a reason, right? So, but they can do that because they go into this deep dorsal shutdown and they hibernate. And then we know animals who are held in zoos, held in captivity, and heck, a lot of our house animals, they get chronic illness, they get diabetes, they gain weight, they have autoimmune problems, they have neurotic problems, right? We talk about that's a crazy cat, that kind of thing, right? And it's because these animals are meant to be out in the wild. Okay, so how does this connect to chronic illness? So remember I said the autonomic nervous system governs these survival mechanisms that I just talked about, the polyvagal theory, and then they govern everything else, our blood flow, our immune system, our hormone release, our respiratory capacity, our lymphatic system that takes waste out, our urinary system, so all our excretions, governs our digestion, which we need to suck up good nutrients and get rid of wastes. It governs all of the glands that release hormones, the reproductive organs. It also governs our social engagement, and it also governs our perception of safety or danger around us. So when we have, and this is the clincher, this is the kicker, so really pay attention to this. This is where they connect. When we are stuck in this fight, flight, and freeze, and then for many who suffer from chronic illness, shutdown and collapse, the system is co-opted into survival. Even if it's just chronic, low-level survival, that is actually, from what we've seen worse, sustained over decades, an entire infancy, childhood, adulthood. That creates a situation where the other things, the upkeep of all the systems I just mentioned, digestion, immune, gut, circulation, safety, danger, those kind of get tossed to the side. They're not important because survival is important. It would be like if you have a burning house is burning down, and all of a sudden it's like, you know what, I think we're going to start dusting today, or we're going to paint some paint on the walls. No, you need to bring the fire people in to extinguish the fire and get rid of the danger. So when we are living in these chronic states of fight, flight, freeze, collapse, shutdown, essentially in a state of helplessness, we can't upkeep our physiology, hence where all these chronic conditions come in. So when we have this cycling, this is what you have to remember, this constant chronic cycling of fight, flight, freeze, shutdown, fight, flight, freeze, shutdown. Typically in a human system, and when we've reached this state of some form of chronic disease, chronic pain, I see lots of people talking about neurodegeneration. This is also a breakdown of the system, not able to regenerate new tissue, new nerves. We have this fluxing, contraction, and dilation of vessels. And we're filled with vessels, tubes that bring blood places through veins and arteries, the moving of juices out of our pancreas, out of our gallbladder, liver. We have our gut that has all sorts of juices and tubes, bladder, That can't be any more clear. Tubes, and we know when we have a lot of dysregulation, this can cause bladder problems. So what happens is we've got this system with all these tubes and highways and byways, and the signal going to these tubes, and I'm really simplifying this, is that of chaos. It's open, open, shut, 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 open, open, shut, 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 open, shut. It's like back and forth. It's like a chaotic symphony, right? Where the orchestra, where the conductor, I should say, is just scattered, as opposed to now we're in openness. Now we're in movement. We're going to open. We're going to bring blood. Now you're resting. Okay, we're going to go into rest, digest. Oh, now it's learning mode. We're going to go into more brain-powered mode. We're going to go into a bit more of a quieting down. Oh, we're in sleep mode. We have to get out of sympathetic. We got to go into rest, digest mode. So you see, these are the elements of a healthy, regulated nervous system. Good flow, good opening and closing of all these vessels and valves, and that's what pushes us into health. Another word for shutdown and collapse, and I mentioned it a second ago, is helplessness. So when we have been brought up in an environment where we are literally helpless and we cannot fend for ourselves, and our primary caregivers are either being abusive, toxic, or they have so many of their own problems, they're working 5 jobs, nobody's home, the little person will feel helpless. And this is where they go into that mode of shutdown and collapse. It even shows in the posture of a collapsed. We would see this in animals who have been abused, that classic tail between the legs. There's no energy, there's no expression. With time, if we don't get out of that, we then go into what we might call, and this is a more classic psychological term, learned helplessness. B.F. Skinner was a classic American psychologist who did experiments, I believe it was with dogs, I think, and he trained them into learned helplessness. So what occurs when we have been hit with so many abuses and adversities, we are literally stuck in, we've learned how to be helpless. And so a big part of this work is getting out of that learned helplessness. Another way of saying it, it's a bit more spicy of a term, is getting out of victim identification mode. Because even having that energy around us of being helpless will not be conducive to us getting out of the helplessness, out of the shutdown, out of the collapse, out of the freeze. And part of this journey for those who are living with chronic pain and chronic illness, and you have been living, and let me know, have you been living in this learned helplessness, in this collapse? Chances are you have, if you have a condition that we would classify as chronic illness or chronic fatigue. And we have to really break out of that and find a different way. And as we do that, we will actually start to feel fight flight energy. So sometimes, and this is my little disclaimer, when we get into this work and we've been shut down for so long, we will feel things like anxiety. We will feel things like fear because we've had them trapped in our bodies for some of us decades, since we were even in utero. This is something I experienced when I came out of a deep functional freeze pattern, very functional. I was very, very functional in my 20s and 30s, started doing this work, and I started having panic attacks that made no sense, started having heart palpitations, all sorts of weird things that made no sense whatsoever. And then I realized, whoa, these are my old survival responses starting to come out. And the reason why it's important that you get this information and this education on board is you might think something is wrong with you when you start to do this work, when you start to get more connected to self, sensations, the body, the environment, you start getting out of fight, flight, freeze, collapse, shutdown. You might think something's wrong. Why am I feeling more jitteriness? Why am I feeling a bit more afraid? Why is my gut doing a few somersaults? It usually is just rock hard and solid. Why am I getting sick a little bit? Why am I moving through some of these interesting symptoms? It's usually because we're bringing up these old things. I'm going to read off a list of things that were noted in a very good book called Trauma Spectrum. I've mentioned this before. This is written by the late Robert Scaer. He was a colleague of Peter Levine's. They connected and collaborated a lot on things. He was a medical physician, worked highly with motor vehicle accident patients, and probably the best write-up of myofascial pain, why that happens in folks who have had motor vehicle accidents. It's sort of a special case study in that book, and how it connects to early trauma. But in this book, he has a whole list of diseases and conditions that he feels are connected to autonomic dysregulation, which usually starts in childhood and even in infancy and in utero. So I'll read these out. It's a long list. Stigmata. Okay, that's a weird one. You might be like, what does that mean, Irene? There's references to the Bible, but this isn't about religion or Christianity. What it means is this is a term that people will use when bruises and red spots come out of the body for quote unquote no reason. What this is old memories that are physical in nature that will start to come up and out when we heal emotions, behaviors, and what's called stored procedural memory. This is actually a really important one. So I got to pause and talk about procedural memory. And I'll make it very simple. So let's just say, I'll use a common one. Let's say you were abused physically as a kid. This happens a lot. We know it happens. Even spanking, that is physical abuse. So let's say we were hit as a kid and quite badly in one area. That area will start to dissociate. It's called somatoform dissociation. We will stop feeling that part of ourselves because we just don't want to. It hurts. So fast forward 50 years and we're doing this work, and we're starting to, part of my work is getting into touch, working with the joints, working with the layers of the body. And we start to feel a little panic. We start to feel a little emotion. We start to feel rage, like, oh my God, I just want to hit this arm to the person that was hitting me. And then I see that person and I scream, stop. This is the system coming out of collapse and shutdown. Now, this wouldn't happen on day one. We build up to this. What can happen, and he talks about it in this book, and this is what stigmata is there can be red marks that come out that even resemble the hand mark of what hit us. And there's many cases of that in this book. And so again, if we don't know about these things, we can have these weird things come out and think something's wrong with me. And it's like, no, actually, this is good. These are old things coming to the surface. So that's what stigmata is. RSD is reflex sympathetic dystrophy. This is kind of stigmata on steroids. And you can look it up. It's basically where there is massive cycling between dilation and constriction of the blood vessels, and you get massive swelling in the joints, in the tissues. One could even say that this kind of would be what someone might call rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. We've had students who have healed from these things because these symptoms, these syndromes occur because of childhood trauma. And then the system is trying to figure out what to do with all this stored stress. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel, GERDs, which is essentially acid reflux, mitral valve prolapse of the heart murmur, multiple chemical sensitivities, migraine headache, whiplash syndrome, myofascial pain, tics, so what we might call spasms, spasmatic torticollis, that's where the neck gets stuck in a certain position and direction, phantom limb pain, premenstrual syndrome, chronic pelvic pain, interstitial cystitis. This is when the bladder gets pressurized and you always feel like you have to pee, but you don't have a bladder infection and there's no urine in there. That is the bladder and the ureters and all those things being in the sake of cycling, essentially dysregulation. Rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. The next two are related to the thyroid, Graves and Hashimoto's, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, ADD and ADHD, sleep disordered breathings like sleep apnea. This is a big one. I got rid of my sleep apnea when I healed my tonsillectomy trauma. True story. Used to snore terribly and I don't anymore. Narcolepsy, cataplexy, these are disorders of sleep where a person will literally just pass out in sitting. These are deep, deep, deep autonomic dysregulations, typically due to overwhelm somewhere in this person's life where they had to just shut down and shut off. Sleep paralysis. I've talked about sleep paralysis in other articles where I talk about surgical and anesthesia and near-death experience trauma. This book is Trauma Spectrum, Robert Scaer. It is a book of theory and hypothesis and past experiences as a medical doctor. It is not a book that teaches you how to do things, but it is probably the best write-up of syndromes. And syndromes are everything I just mentioned. It's where there is this cycling of high, fight, flight, freeze with this kind of swing to collapse and shut down.